Well, welcome to today's Cine-Master-class. With us, we have our frequent collaborator, Mr. Alexander. And Mr. Alexander will be introducing and giving a small Cine-Master-class on this wonderful Russian film by this wonderful Russian director. And without much ado, I think we should start. Mr. Alexander.
Good evening, dear friends. Today's film or a film has brought to your attention is The Ascent from 1977. And first we'll talk about the life and work of the director Larisa Shepitko. According to some critics, Larisa Shepitko, the Soviet Ukrainian director, was one of the most influential women directors of all time. And she was definitely one of the most outstanding film directors in Soviet Union in the 60s and the 70s. Soviet cinema has produced quite a number of female directors, and she was probably the most important of them, despite her rather limited output. Larisa Shepitko was born into a family of school teachers in an industrial city of Bakhmut in the Donbas industrial belt. You must have heard the name of Bakhmut 1.5 years ago when it was very much in the news due to rather tragic reasons. So she was born just before the beginning of World War II and the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. She had no time to really connect to Bakhmut as her home, and when the war broke out, she and her mother had to be evacuated to the Soviet hinterland along with the millions of other people. While her father was very much in the army and fought all through the war, survived, came back, but he was wrecked by the experience of being at the front, and he left the family. So that became a scarring experience for the mother, I'm sure, as well as for the daughter, for little Larisa. So when she returned after the war to her native town, there wasn't really much to return to, and she was sent for schooling to the West Ukrainian city of Lvov, where she spent 10 years, the standard time of Soviet schooling. And the school where she studied is now decorated with a memorial plaque, which is hopefully still there. So after completing her schooling in Lvov, she moved directly to Moscow and luckily made it to the most prestigious cinema school in the country, the All-Union Institute of Cinematography, named after Gerasimov. It was the topmost school for filmmakers in the Soviet Union, that produced the best directors, including Andrei Tarkovsky. Incidentally, she knew Tarkovsky, they were quite friendly, and he was several years ahead of her in the film school. She was lucky twice. Not only she got immediately after completion of her school into such a prestigious institution, she got into the class of the outstanding Soviet Ukrainian director Alexander Dovzhenko, who taught in that school at the institute, and even though he passed away soon after her entering the class, they still had 1.5 years of overlap, and she was really very much influenced by his realistic approach and technique, and even considered him her mentor. So, by the way, as you see from this wonderful illustration, she was quite a beautiful woman, not a typical Slavonic kind of beauty, with remarkable bone structure. For all I know, she could have been an actress herself or a model, but instead she was a director, although she also acted. During her student years in Moscow, Shepitko started acting in films. All in all, she acted in 6 pictures, 3 of them during her student years. Most of her roles were absolutely secondary, many of them just cameos, so minor that she wasn't even mentioned in the credit. These were very different films in terms of their genre, from comedy to drama to historical drama, very different films. And out of 6, 2 films in which she acted were actually directed by her husband. We are going to talk to him about him later. She completed the standard 5-year course in the institute, and her graduation work was titled Heat. Here we have the vintage poster of this film. We can call it vintage because it's been already exactly 60 years. This graduation work earned her a prize at the institute. It was based on the short story by the great Kyrgyz writer Chingiz Aytmatov, whose many works were also made into films. And it talked about an idealistic young man back in the 50s traveling into the deserts of Central Asia, Soviet Central Asia, in very remote areas, and trying to help at the collective farm, which is run by realistic Stalin-era administration, and they get into conflict with each other and head towards a showdown. So for that, to shoot this film, the crew obviously had to travel into semi-desert in summer, and where they experienced the temperatures up to 45 degrees. It was very difficult for someone like her, because she came from a much colder climate. So she fell sick. She also contracted a virus, and she had to direct this picture basically being bedridden. But despite all these challenges, she succeeded, and the picture was noticed. So her success with his first picture, Heat, was very much due to the timely help rendered to her by her co-student, Elem Klimov. They were students at the same institute. He was in love with Larisa. He proposed to her, was rejected. When she needed him, when she was stranded in a helpless condition in a semi-desert area in Central Asia, so she called for him, for his help, and all the way he came from Moscow to help her to direct and basically save the picture. So without him, she probably wouldn't have been able to do it, and she accepted his proposal finally, and they married later in the same year. And remained married till the very end of Larisa's short life. Dear friends, you probably would agree that the unions between outstanding creative personalities very often tend to be rocky. But that was an exceptional example in the sense that their union, their family was very much successful. Not only they helped each other without encroaching upon each other's perception of the world, they projected a very pleasant image of a successful couple. So they were very presentable, even photographically. They were known to the cinema world, and both of them probably somehow inspired each other's work without, again, encroaching upon each other's creativity. And they became a pin-up of the cinema world of the 60s and 70s. And also both of them belonged to the so-called Russian New Wave of the 60s and 70s, which was inspired by Khrushchev's partial policy of opening up, when cinema was allowed to explore certain subjects, certain topics that were impossible to explore just 10 years prior to that. I think it will be in order to talk shortly about Larisa's husband, who was a remarkable film director in his own right. His most widely known feature is a war film titled Come and See, released in 1985. It's a story of a teenage boy joining resistance in the World War II time Belarus, and being with a group of partisans in the jungle. The film definitely drew on the director's personal experience. He was several years older than his wife, and his experience of war was evacuation from the besieged Stalingrad. When later he shared about this experience, he said that I saw hell. So when he had to cross the Volga River from Stalingrad onto the Soviet-capped bank of the river, and later on move into the hinterland. So what he saw, we can only imagine, but it was a scarring experience, even though he was a child. The film was very successful. It won him international recognition. Incidentally, the director Steven Spielberg acknowledged the influence of this particular film upon his pictures Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan. He did not specify what exactly was the influence. That would be very interesting to actually find out, but that is his acknowledgement. His even more important and much more powerful film was titled Agony, completed in '75 and released due to censorship issues 10 years later in 1985, talking about the last months of the Russian Empire and the assassination of the controversial godman Gregory Rasputin. It's extremely powerful black and white film. I would even rank it much higher than the internationally acclaimed Come and See, but that's my personal opinion. So Larisa graduated successfully. Her graduation work was accepted, and she took up a challenge, her first independent picture, the topic of her choice, the actors of her choice, and that was titled Wings, the story of a much decorated woman pilot from World War II who finds it extremely difficult to adjust to civil life after the war experience. From the freedom of the skies, she moves into the constraints and strictures of the structured peacetime bureaucratic society, she becomes disillusioned and takes up a very insignificant, in a way insignificant job of school teacher. And even though she works with kids, she doesn't understand even her own teenage daughter, what her teenage daughter is going through. The film centers on the inner world of a middle-aged woman, who is played, by the way, very brilliantly. And this woman had gone through a crucible, through the crucible of war. It is in no way an autobiography, but it is definitely something that the director was able to relate to. She was not middle-aged. She didn't see much of the war herself. She was a child. She experienced it as an evacuated civilian. It's quite different. But since the entire society went through so much in those years, there were certain things that people understood and related to, even though they didn't directly experience it. So she definitely related to some of that experience. And her mother, who was abandoned by her father, so the family was wrecked by this war experience indirectly. So some of it found its way into the picture. Also, the director very boldly broached certain topics that would be explored in the Soviet cinema only much later. For instance, the idea of the topic of the generation gap, and the topic of family conflicts. Well, according to the Soviet establishment, Soviet family was a happy family. There could not be any conflicts. And also the heroine of the film, how could she be lost in civil life? She's a war hero. War hero cannot be lost. So the establishment was not like very happy with the angle that the director took, and the picture was actually banned. It ran for a while. It ran for a while in the theaters, but eventually it was removed. So here we have a very interesting photograph showing the director, Larisa Shepitko, on the right, directing her lead character in this picture, Wings, along with her crew. Around the same time, Shepitko started having problem with censorship. So, as I mentioned, it started with the criticism of her picture Wings, but that was not censorship as such. It's just that some art critics, some film critics in Soviet Union found it strange. But things became much worse when she was commissioned to join the production of a trilogy. The trilogy titled Beginning of an Unknown Era, and meant to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution. So it was a trilogy, and Larisa Shepitko was asked to create the second part, and what she did somehow presented the members of the Communist Party in a not very attractive light. So that was definitely noticed by the establishment, and in the event, the film was shelved and released 20 years later. So since she lived a very short life, she never saw it released. Must have felt pretty bad. Her next picture, You and Me, kind of satire on the Soviet consumerism, was again quite unwelcome, because according to the official ideology, consumerism even the word does not associate with the socialist way of life, or shouldn't be associated. It should go with the capitalist way of life. So, and even though some literary figures explored moral corruption and consumerism in the Soviet society, her making a satirical film on it was again not so welcome, and the Soviet government tried to prevent it from going to the Venice International Film Festival. So Larisa was prevailed upon to make some changes in her work, and she bowed down to this pressure, and she hated herself for that. Eventually she removed some parts of that film, and she hated herself, as she said, for butchering my own work. The film went to the festival, won the prize at Venice, but she was not happy. So all of it taken together took toll on her mental health, and she had to retire to the sanatorium in the Black Sea resort of Sochi, where a couple of years ago the Winter Olympics took place, if you remember. So she was recovering there for several months, being in a state of, as she herself acknowledged, in a state of physical and mental exhaustion. The pinnacle of Larisa Shepitko's career was undoubtedly tonight's focus of our attention, the picture The Ascent. This work defined her as a film director and brought her worldwide fame. 2 words about the background, her personal background, what she was going through around this time. So first of all, just 1 or 2 years prior to that, she had that stint in a, okay, let's not call it a mental hospital, but sanatorium, where she was exhausted after feeling really done out by this confrontation with the censor board and reaction of Soviet critics to her work. And on top of it, she delivered a child after having suffered a spine injury. So that was purely accidental, but she suffered the spine injury while being pregnant, and she still managed to deliver a son. But the experience was so threatening to her life and so painful that she became fixated on the idea of death. She started asking herself the question about the meaning of life, and that was her personal backdrop to this picture. Personally, this picture was extremely important for her. Later on, she would say that to me, the need to create the Ascent was almost physical. I felt, had I not made it, it would have been my end. Which is a very powerful statement in its own right. So, a couple of words about the historical background of this film. We are talking about World War II in Belarus, today's state of Belarus. At that time, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Belarus within Soviet Union. On June 22nd, 1941, when the Nazi Germany attacked Soviet Union, the group of armies center slammed through Belarus and went directly for Moscow. The advance was extremely fast. On 22nd of June, they crossed the border, and by the end of the same week, by the end of June, they already occupied the city of Minsk, which is in the center of Belarus and is the capital of Belarus even today. You can see the city of Minsk there. By the end of the same summer, the entire area of Belarus, the summer of 1941, had already come under the Nazi control, and the Nazi army continued going towards Moscow. So that was the beginning of the Nazi occupation, which lasted for 3 years. And exactly 3 years. So 3 years later, the last area of Belarus was liberated by the Soviets. What was the Nazi leadership's plans for the East Europe in general and specifically for Soviet Union? There is this classified document called the General Plan Ost, which existed in several versions, and it was drafted slightly before the Nazi attack on Soviet Union. The idea in general was to take over the European part of the Soviet Union and colonize it, and the General Plan Ost was meant to prepare the ground for that, for this colonization. It presupposed the reduction, the drastic reduction of the Soviet local population by several dozen million through various means. Decommunization, Holocaust, forceful transfer of the population across the Urals and to Siberia, transfer of the youth, local youth, as indentured laborers, forced labor in Europe, in the Nazi-controlled Europe, and also the so-called hunger plan, when the fields of Ukraine and South Russia were supposed to be taken over, harvested, and all that grain was supposed to be taken to the Nazi Germany, and the local population should have either migrated or starved to death. So in response to this policy, there was a widespread anti-Nazi guerrilla movement. Eventually, partisans came to control large areas within Belarus. So I'm sorry, it's a Russophone map. I couldn't find anything more understandable for you. But this pink area, this is Belarus within its present borders, and those orange spots are the areas that were actually controlled by the Soviet guerrillas. The first bands of guerrillas were organized already in the summer of 1941, when the Soviet command knew that they could not hold Belarus, and when the Soviet army, badly mauled by the Nazis, were rapidly retreating. Partisans managed to control several regional centers. They ran a network of hidden airports, and basically they were supplied from the Soviet-controlled area, and they were also coordinated in their activities from Moscow. So there were different types of partisan groups. First of all, there were Soviet partisans, bands of escaped prisoners of war, local people, local Jewish population also, because it was the only way for the Jewish population to actually survive. There was the so-called Polish National Army, Armia Krajowa, that operated mainly in the western part of Belarus, because western Belarus until 1939 had been East Poland. and there were some Jewish units also. So there were also some collaborationist Soviet units set up by the Nazis who decided to switch sides, and they did so en masse. All in all, there were up to 100,000 of such fighters, and we should understand that it's a dynamic number, since the mortality among the partisans was pretty high, so it means at any given time there was this number. At the peak of this movement, it was 100,000, so people would come, they would join the movement, they would get killed or maimed, the new people would join, again will get killed. So it's a dynamic number. So all in all, many more people went through this experience than the number 100,000 suggests. So the typical partisan activities, the main activity was targeting supply lines of the group of armies center. Railways, blasting railways and destroying the railway bridges. That was like extremely important. The result of it was that the supplies of the Nazi armies trying to capture Moscow was compromised. To what extent the partisan activity contributed to the lack of the Nazi success in the Battle of Moscow, it's difficult to say, but practically, yeah. So railways and bridges were attacked and destroyed. Also, there were attacks on the Nazi garrisons. The local collaborators were also targeted, and there were also attempts to assassinate some high-ranking Nazi officials. For instance, one of the very important high-ranking officials was assassinated by a Belarusian female partisan who pretended to be his girlfriend and planted explosives under his bed, and he was blown to bits. The Nazi response to this widespread and dangerous movement was a system of reprisals. There were different kinds of reprisals. Some methods that were practiced by the Nazis in other parts of East Europe, like in the Balkans or in Greece, included random execution of civilians for each and every Nazi casualty to drive a wedge between the local population and the partisans, and to create consternation and hatred among the local people to the partisans. Rounded partisans were executed very often publicly, and people were gathered forcefully to see it so that they don't have any wrong ideas to help partisans. I'm saying all this because a lot of it will be shown in the film. I'm providing a background so that things just fall into their proper place. The suspected and actual partisans, if they were rounded up, they were obviously tortured for information. And the areas, you remember in the previous map, there were those orange patches controlled by the partisans. So these areas were raided by the so-called Einsatzgruppen, the deployment forces that actually eliminated the local support for the partisans by eliminating the population, sometimes burning entire villages along with their inhabitants. So, as a result, 1/4, 25% of the Belarusian population perished during the war, and it became the highest percentage of human loss among all the Soviet republics. In this task of eradication or containment of the partisans, the Nazi administration relied on the local collaborationist units. So, who were the local collaborators? So, the lowest rank were the collaborationist police, the Polizei, usually distinguished by the white armbands, so you can see the armbands here, and mostly having no uniform. Here they're marching together at some kind of function in Minsk, by the way, during the Nazi occupation, but normally they had no uniform, and we are going to see them shortly in the film. They mostly had guarding duties. They assisted at executions, whoever needed to be executed, in the opinion of the Nazi administration. Then there were SS divisions. SS divisions, in the beginning, they were ethnically German. Very soon, some local people in the occupied Soviet territories were drafted into their own SS divisions. And very often, these SS divisions were deployed in such a way that they would have no empathy for the local population. They would not be deployed in their own area. They would be deployed elsewhere. For instance, the Latvian SS division was deployed in northeastern Belarus, around the city of Vitebsk, incidentally the native city of the celebrated artist Marc Chagall. The SS, Galician SS division from Western Ukraine was deployed against the partisans in Slovakia and in Yugoslavia, and the so-called Russian Liberation Army, drawn from the POWs, Soviet POWs, and some Azerbaijani battalions, again drawn from among the Azerbaijani POWs, participated in the suppression of the ill-fated Warsaw Uprising in 1944, which was put down with a lot of blood, and so they actively participated in that activity. By the way, the film by Andrzej Wajda, Canal, talks about the tragic end of the Warsaw Uprising. Today's film, The Ascent, is based on the novel by the celebrated Soviet Belarusian writer Vasil Bykov. He himself was a war veteran. He fought all through the war and survived. Became a writer after the war, penned a dozen novels and a very, very big number of short stories. All of them war-related, most of them Belarus-based. Many of them were made into films. There were screen versions of his books. He was widely published in Soviet times and received multiple awards, and even earned a nomination for the Nobel Prize, which is not a small thing. Just to provide a bit of a background, war-related literature and cinema in Soviet Union broadly fell into two streams. The heroic story with a happy end, and the heroic story with a tragic end. So Vasil Bykov followed the second trend. So his stories normally involve very few characters, no important names, no big battles like Stalingrad or whatever. He focuses on unknown, anonymous people who show heroism, and that heroism is not known and noticed by anyone else, except for those who die along with them. So the typical story would be something like that. A sabotage reconnaissance group sets out on a mission behind the enemy lines, and suddenly things go south. They run into the enemy, some of them perish, someone gets wounded, he slows down the rest of the group, so he commits suicide. They run out of ammo, they're surrounded because the enemy starts hunting them down. So in the end, they all perish, and it becomes a tragedy, not on the scale of Stalingrad, because it involves just a few very small number of people, but it becomes an unknown tragedy, the tragedy that actually millions of people experienced and went through in the time of war, becoming heroes but remaining unknown and unsung. So that would be the typical skeleton of almost each and every writing by Vasil Bykov, and therefore of the film that we are going to show shortly. So he explores the feelings that these ordinary people at war go through when they face difficult circumstances, when they face death, and the moral dilemmas that accompany this situation. So, by the way, in the previous slide, we saw a collage showing Vasil Bykov and with some themes behind related to war, the concentration camp images and some fighting images. So the film, The Ascent, is based on the novel titled Sotnikov, after the main hero. It's a story focusing on two characters, two members of the resistance, the partisan band in the forest, who set out on a foraging mission. And one of them is strong and healthy and kind of happy, and the other one is sickly, wrecked with cough, and clearly not up to the task. So we see the two characters, a shot from the film. These two characters are played by the actors, Soviet actors, Boris Plotnikov, who is shown reclining here, and Vladimir Gostyukin, who is shown sitting upright. The casting was done by the director herself, Larisa Shepitko. Both were relatively unknown actors, and for both of them, this film became a turning point in their career. So Plotnikov came from a theater background, from a provincial town. He never played a role of that magnitude. As for the second character, Gostyukin, he was very passionate. Again, he came from a theater background, was very passionate about theater, but most of the time he spent in theater was spent by him being a backstage assistant. So, but in the end, as we shall see, both of them performed magnificently. In accordance with the spirit of Vasil Bykov's prose, things start going wrong on their mission, and very soon they face an archetypal choice: life or honor. And the person who forces this choice upon them is a collaborationist police officer, played by a brilliant actor, Anatoly Solonitsyn, extremely talented person who appeared in several important pictures by Andrei Tarkovsky, including Stalker and Andrei Rublev. In fact, he was, we can say, the favorite actor of Andrei Tarkovsky, and had both of them lived longer, because both of them departed this life rather before their time, had both of them lived longer, they could have cooperated even more. Only here in this film he plays a sickening and disgusting character, which only underscores his talent as an actor, because the wider the range of the characters that you can perform, the deeper is your personality and skill as an actor. So he acted, the difference is enormous between Andrei Rublev, where he plays an icon painter who is on a kind of spiritual quest. He suffers seeing the moral degradation of his society, his motherland ripped apart by enemies, and loss of inspiration, and he wants to find something to put on the cathedral walls, and he cannot, and he's struggling with himself. And here it's a collaborationist officer. We are going to see it shortly. The less I say, the better. Is extremely disagreeable character. So this difference of roles that he is able to play is really enormous. So Larisa Shepitko, whom we can see here on the sets of the film, directed the film with utmost energy. The filming started in the month of January in not in Belarus but in Russia, in the countryside. She participated in it very actively. She very much participated in the script writing. There was a script writer, but she got involved into this process and contributed very significantly to the script. She selected the actors. It was her choice and her gamble to find people relatively unknown, the gamble that paid off. And during the shoot, the temperatures fell to minus 40 degrees. It was a typical East European or Russian winter. And she deliberately was underdressed. She dressed into the kind of things that her characters were wearing because she wanted to experience it. And since filming involves hours and hours of setting up the equipment, being with the actors, explaining to them take after take what is wanted from them, you can imagine what it is, doing all this when the temperature is 40 degrees below zero. So it's quite an interesting experience. She did 45 degrees above zero in the desert, and then minus 40 in a snow desert, so to say. It is interesting to see how the crew members and the actors reacted and reminisced about that experience. So some of them said that each frame was a painful experience. Another person said it was a transformational experience. We matured along with the film. The actor, one of the two main characters, Vladimir Gostyukin, was so emotionally shocked by what he had to go through, by what she put him through, that he continued to be in that state of shock for weeks and weeks, even after the film was done. So much so that he refused Larisa Shepitko's offer to join her next project. I'm sure he regretted that later, but that was his condition. He was so profoundly shocked. In fact, his acting is, even though he plays in a way eventually a negative character, I would say his acting his acting skills here are much higher. So 2 words about the camera work. There were 2 cameramen who did, I would say, a very good job, a superb job. The film is shot in black and white. In general, Shepitko tried herself in color cinema, but she didn't quite like it. She tried it twice, but I think she herself believed that black and white was better. And black and white film is definitely better to convey the feeling of the winter landscape in Russia, in Belarus, in entire East Europe. The winter landscape there is monochromatic. It's large expanse of white or gray, depending on the time of the day, and grayish, blackish lines of naked forest without leaves, without life, and very short daylight. So the feeling is very much there. Panoramic shots like this with vast expanse and 2 characters, you know, wading through snow, going across the field. They alternate with close-ups of the characters that immediately create this sense of intimacy with the character. And this alternation is definitely the director's technique. 2 words about the composer. The composer who created the original soundtrack for this picture was the Soviet composer of German ethnicity, Alfred Schnittke, who had several ballets and operas under his belt, and who created several soundtracks for the films of Larisa Shepitko's husband, L.M. Klimov. So the kind of soundtrack he created is extremely powerful in the sense that it's very disturbing. It really matches the emotional content of the film. But it is also very variable. It is slow where it needs to be slow. It is very disturbing where it needs to be disturbing. So it's very innovative, but within the framework of the European classical music. While preparing for this program, I was thinking of selecting some iconic shots for you, for the audience, but I realized that it's a very ungrateful task because there are too many of them. A lot of shots in this film can be considered iconic, so I decided to show you this collage, and then it's up to you to choose what the shots that affect you more, that you would like most. The director proved to be a real master of emotionally charged close-ups of the character. In fact, the whole film is packed with those close-ups that create this feeling of intimacy. And in a single moment show a very profound psychological portrait of the character at this particular time. Her interest and her attention to minute details, to those that are conveyed through those close-ups, was really very, very deep, so much so that the author of the novel on which this film is based, Vasil Bykov, after watching this film said that, oh, Shepitko is a Dostoevsky in skirts, so which in a way can be treated as a compliment. Yeah. So on average, I think you would agree that women are more psychological than men. And I don't know how much of that deep psychology in this film comes from her professional training as a film director, and how much of it comes from her simply being a sensitive woman. It's a question. I don't know. It's for you to decide. So what is the film actually about? At the heart of it is the issue of moral choice. What happens to us when we are forced to choose between our life on the one hand and our country, our family, our identity, our loyalty on the other hand? Thank God, very few of us have to choose it. But this is exactly what the director tries to explore. And all the characters that we come across in this film, there are not so many of them, but all of them have made this choice and are living or dying with the consequences of their choice. Our life, well, it's this very body is the greatest asset that we have. For most of us, it's the greatest asset. And we are instinctively drawn to save it, sometimes at any cost. But if the cost is too high, if trying to save this body, this life, we betray everything else that we are and secure this life, is this life in the end worth living? That is the question that the director poses and answers indirectly, and shows that no matter what you do after, but after you have made such a betrayal on such a scale, you will never be able to live peacefully. You will never be appreciated and accepted by your new masters. You will always be despised and on the margins somewhere. So eventually the film was released without censorship. There was an entire story behind it. It was not so easy, but I won't go into these details. It was noticed immediately. It won prizes at home. It won prizes abroad. At the Berlin International Film Festival, it won Golden Bear. It was released after 2 to 2.5 years of editing by the director without the interference of censorship. And in the same year, in Berlin, it won that prize. And the director was very much noticed. The film earned her international recognition. Suddenly, big names, big directors from the international cinema wanted to shake her hand. Francis Coppola, Bertolucci, Milos Forman became her friends. She started moving in those circles. And was even invited to join the jury at the next International Film Festival in Berlin. Larisa Shepitko's career was taking off. She had a lot going for her. You know, there is this opinion that men run out of their creative steam by the age of 40, while women, on the contrary, pick up at the age of 40 once they're done. It's an opinion. It's an opinion. Once they are done with family and something else, if they have family. So many women rediscover themselves after the age of 40 in politics, in spiritual quest, in culture, in whatever, in social work. We can quote the example of the mother who returned to Pondicherry at the age of, 42. We can quote the example of the famous popularizer of Tibetan Buddhism, in Europe, Alexander David Neal, who had a tremendous career in ballet and retired at the age of 40, in the sense that she suddenly felt that all of it was no more important, and she reinvented herself as a traveler across the East. She came to India, tried to go to Tibet. Such examples would be many. So if we agree with this point of view, which I don't invite you to agree with, but if, then we can say that her career was just picking up. But it was cut short very tragically. At the age of 41, while scouting locations for her last picture, she and her entire crew perished in a freaky accident which shocked the entire cinema world in Soviet Union. The people who knew her, like Tarkovsky, they almost had no word to express what they were going through. Her husband was devastated. He never remarried after that, even though he outlived her by several decades. He never remarried. Somehow, his career petered out. Apart from, she perished in 1979. His last picture came out in 1985, Come and See. After that, he didn't do much. He was very much circulating in those movie circles and whatnot, but he wasn't creating anything new. He managed to complete her picture. He managed to shoot a small 20-minute long tribute to his wife, titled Larisa, but that was all that he could do. So such was the life and work of Larisa Shepitko, and thank you for your attention. So let us watch the film.